So let's start with looking at the new features in SharePoint 2016. Before we dive into this, though, I'd like to make one particular comment. One of Microsoft's strategies with the products in this release wave is that products are being built to be on a shorter release cycle, to have fewer major releases and more minor releases or updates. So as we go through these features, this is what SharePoint 2016 is looking like at its release period. If you're looking at this course maybe in 2018 or so, between major releases, be aware that this very well may not be comprehensive. You may have seen significant new features come into play through quarterly or annual releases while still being labeled as SharePoint 2016. So while this is a list of some of the more important new features, this by no means may be all of the new features by the time you look at this course. So be aware of that. We will try and make notes as the course goes along and do updates on this, but just be aware that the days of new features only coming on major releases or major service packs are past, and that you may see significant differences in these new features from what you see, mainly around additions, but it could be possible, depending upon how the new features are received or items that are found, that some of these new features may even be retracted by the time the next major release of SharePoint comes along. So enough about the philosophy on release schedules in SharePoint. One of the things to look at is file accessibility. Being able to get to those, being able to actually work with files in SharePoint. Traditionally, you've had a couple of ways to do file management in SharePoint. It's been either as attachments on lists or kind of the first manner of doing things, a document library where your files are associated with that. You may have a way to synchronize with formerly Groove or Live Drive for Business or whatever, I forget the exact marketing term, or today OneDrive for Business, to be able to synchronize and have your files locally to work with, whereas you operate with them just as a file system. But it's been normally on SharePoint itself as a web page and dealt with files that way. With 2016, you're going to see a lot more ability to be able to use key commands to move around. You're going to be able to actually work with keyboard shortcuts as you work with files in SharePoint. And a lot of this is coming into place that's replacing some of the work that happened previously with the document library plugin web part that used to be in with SharePoint, that would be able to actually run inside the browser. The new SharePoint usage model is based strictly on HTML5 and being standards compliant. So doing plugins like that is not really in line with the SharePoint philosophy. But being able to use HTML5 and modern browsers means that being able to do things like keyboard shortcuts and being able to work with files more like you would work with in a file system is now possible in the browser experience. So just know that working with this is a lot easier. Make a note of that. Try it out because it's going to make your users probably happier. But it's also one of these features that, unless you know about it, you're probably not going to discover it just by accident. You actually have to kind of go out there and look for it and really kind of be familiar with it. One of the items that is really, really valuable, especially for lots of organizations, is durable links. What you will notice is that with lists and with a lot of items inside of SharePoint, GUIDs are used a lot. So that no matter what happens with something, no matter what views you're going on, you'll actually always have a link back to documents. You'll notice in previous versions of SharePoint, document libraries, if you renamed a document or if you moved it around inside your SharePoint location, maybe put it in different folders or the rest of that, your links would break. This was counteracted a bit by being able to actually basically check-in documents and have them have a permanent location in some of the repositories. That's nice, but that's kind of needs a lot more discipline than a lot of organizations have with SharePoint. What you'll see in SharePoint 2016 is now you'll have a durable link for SharePoint files. So even if you do rename a file or move it in different folders or move it around, things that you normally do operate with when you're talking about things as files, and especially if you're working with files that may be synchronized to a desktop with OneDrive for Business, that those links will maintain. It will make sure that you can always get back to that, and even if it's been pushed down in a folder or pulled back up, that the links for that file will not break. So this is really valuable if you've had problems with this before. I think you'll be very, very happy with this. And if you haven't had problems with this before, you probably won't notice it because you're probably not using files that much. But if that has been a problem in your organization in the past, you may have some very manual processes to make sure that doesn't change. This will be something that you'll be very happy to see. The other piece is that up until now, SharePoint has had standard HTTP. In the last number of years, it has become very visible and very critical for web apps to default to encrypted connections, especially if you're in a situation where your users may not be on premises. They may be at a third-party location. Maybe you've got salespeople that often operate out of maybe coffee shops or customer locations or those kind of things. Having SharePoint default to unencrypted connections meant that there was always a bit of a security risk, man-in-the-middle attacks, or just being able to read what was going on across the SharePoint connection with that. It did not mean that you could not have SharePoint move over to an encrypted connection, HTTPS, but that was not the default, and a lot of organizations did not do that. Out of the box, SharePoint defaults to encrypted connections, and you kind of have to tell it to do unencrypted if that's what you choose to do. I'm not really sure of what are any good scenarios for why you would not want to do that. One thing to mention on this is as you set up SharePoint, if you're doing an on-prem, it makes it a lot easier to make sure you've got those certs for your HTTPS in place. So not only does it make it default, it makes it easier for you to actually set up and manage those connections so that wherever your users are, they're going to get a nice secure connection back to your SharePoint. They're not going to be able to be sniffed or spoofed or all the rest of that. So be aware of that. Very big movement forward. It's one letter on the URL, but it makes a big difference in security and being able to manage what goes into your SharePoint and not have maybe things inserted along the way. Mention the durable links with your document libraries. The other piece is, especially if you're used to using file shares or those kind of, or just standard file systems, you'll know that as things were put into SharePoint, there were a lot of characters that were allowed on a file system that were not allowed inside of SharePoint for various reasons. What you'll see is that some of those special characters are now allowed in SharePoint. Things such as and, brackets, some of the different dashes. So you're actually able to go in there and work with those. You'll have less situations where adding files into SharePoint need to be renamed to handle the naming conventions. It is more like what you're actually going to see on the file system. That doesn't mean you get all of them. You're still going to have some items that you're going to have to worry about with that. Oh, and the file name length has been increased as well. So you now aren't limited to the old 128 character. You can now add some additional ones. Know that that part is a bit of a mixed blessing. Because now that you can have more characters on your file names, but do remember that the entire URL length still has some challenges with certain browsers. So being able to understand what's going on with that, don't go crazy with making very long file names to make them nice and accessible, because you just may shoot yourself in the foot if you've got some highly nested SharePoint sites or document libraries or such, and things with long names. Still be careful with trying to be concise and as informative as possible, but as concise as possible when you're doing your naming on everything in SharePoint. One of the interesting things that's happening with SharePoint is hybrid Office 365 and on-site. This is one of the things that you've had hybrid SharePoint before, but how this is working is actually going to be a little bit different. This is one of the situations that you need to pay particular attention to if you're an on-site SharePoint user, mainly because this is something that can help you work around some of the shortcomings that you may witness in SharePoint on-site. And I say that specifically because, as you've seen, SharePoint as an on-premises is no longer the first tier experience in SharePoint. You will see new features coming into Office 365 earlier, and you will have situations where there are SharePoint features that will only be available in the SharePoint cloud. They will not make it into the on-prem SharePoint feature set. What Office 365 and on-prem hybrid is the ability to actually have your SharePoint implementation split between those two implementations, to be able to actually have things such as your Office 365 be aware of what's going on site and vice versa. I say start with Office 365 and knowing what's on site is because generally if you wanted on site to know what's going on with an Office 365 location, previous generations, that's pretty easy. You would basically treat it either as a remote SharePoint site or to be able to just treat it as a website to be able to do things like web crawls for search context and those kind of things. With SharePoint 2016, you have the ability to actually have your Office 365 understand what's going on your on-site as well. So whichever side of the implementation they're on, both sides know about each other. This is also made possible by the ability to do the Active Directory federation between your on-site and your SharePoint implementation in Office 365 or in the cloud. This means that being able to do a crawl of your on-prem from off-prem, or share the search context even as you move back and forth, and both of them will be using the same identity capabilities, so that when you're doing searches, one of the big challenges with SharePoint has always been making sure that secured information is not surfaced to people who aren't authorized to see that. With this capability, you're able to go through, have a search on both your cloud implementation and your on-prem, show those together, and actually be able to put everything in place so that it all works correctly. It all gives the right context, it all gives the right information for all of your users, and nothing gets leaked outside of the silos that it should be stored in. So very useful. This also allows your on-site people to gain access to those new features that are maybe in Office 365 simply by provisioning them on the Office 365 as well. So for example, if you have users that are interested in using Sway Presentation Manager, that is an Office 365 only implementation. If you actually have your hybrid O365 on-site, users that want to be able to use that capability can access that capability from surfaced on any of your locations that may be on-site. When you need to have that capability, it'll move them over to the cloud capability and be able to use it there, and use it with all the information and data that's stored on site of your implementation as well. So it's a little bit of the best of both worlds for as you're putting it together, but it is something that you do need to be aware of and think of through all the scenarios and kind of think through the bandwidth requirements as it moves back and forth and make sure that everything's in place. And as I mentioned, that this is the piece that you need to look at is the Office 365 Identity and Search. With the AD Federation, with being able to actually synchronize between the two and be able to actually have the information in the Azure Active Directory and your on-site Active Directory be kept in sync, and I will have I know a couple of people who will actually jump on me about the using synchronization instead of federation, but it is in effect being able to have the same information in both places. you can actually very easily provision, move back and forth, be able to have your users have a seamless experience back and forth between what's going on in Office 365 and what's going on in your SharePoint location. This is one of those pieces that was very important as Office 365 improved and matured as a full solution, making sure that you're using not just a single sign-on, which you had multiple accounts that were passed back and forth behind the scenes, but you're actually able to synchronize that identity between the different repositories and actually be able to point back to that person and say, this is who did this across all of those services. It is very important and very valuable for your organization, being able to track across not just server or an implementation, but across all of the locations that use that identity is very powerful for your organization. And this also means that as you used to be able to do with branch caches or branch implementations of SharePoint, now you've got that capability to work out in the cloud and do all of that. And that being said, as I mentioned with search, that identity and the ability for your SharePoint implementations to know about each other and know all of the correct contexts between them means that you actually have the ability to do that search. Be able to do either a proper localization for the search or to be able to cast that search as broadly as possible while still maintaining the security and the rights management across all of that information becomes very, very valuable. It makes it so that you can find all that information throughout your organization and even on that implementation that's outside your organization with the appropriate rights and with the appropriate views, so that what should be seen is seen by everybody and what should be restricted is restricted only the appropriate people at the appropriate time. And then there's OneDrive for business integration. This is one of those fun pieces. I've got some challenges with the naming, but being able to actually have OneDrive for business do all of those things that LiveDrive used to do or Groove used to do for tying in with SharePoint document libraries and keeping those files on your desktop or local to you if you're disconnected, work with it, and then synchronize those changes back up into your SharePoint implementation, wherever those may be. Know that you'll probably need to have a bit of discussion with your users about the difference between OneDrive and OneDrive for Business. Many of them will know this. Even if they do say it, make sure that you do discuss it with them. If they look at you and nod and say, absolutely, I understand this, cover it anyway, because it sometimes does get confusing. One of the challenges is that they will have OneDrive for Business and OneDrive clients going. Finding which one is appropriate is their files are in is not that bad. But if you're in an organization that's using Windows 10 that has both a business account and a personal account, where what's in each of those clients may be different identities, is something to pay attention to. This is one of those things that if you've provisioned your SharePoint for Office 365 and you have say an E1, E3, E5 license for your users, and your users are logging in to their desktops with something that is with a local account or something that's different, know that you need to have them join to domains, or it can get very, very confusing, or they can add a work account separate from their personal account, which has their OneDrive, and things can get a little confusing about which identity is being used where. This is a problem that's probably going to be resolved and continue to be worked, but it is a bit of a basic issue as you're working with cloud services, being able to know what identity the user is logged into their computer. Maybe they're using a live ID, a personal ID on their computer. We're using any device situations where the users may bring their own device into the organization. That device may be or may not be attached to the internal domain, or it may be attached to the Active Directory domain. All of these things are things that you need to pay attention to, but specifically in OneDrive for Business, it becomes a little bit challenging, because know that if they've got a live ID, then that is a different ID than their Office 365 identity, even though it may be the same email address. Again, we'll probably go into this a bit more in the administrators, but just know that while the functionality is good, and it actually seems to be, to me, more solid than the standard Windows 10 OneDrive client. Sorry, but OneDrive's for Windows 10 has some challenges. With OneDrive for Business, the integration's solid. Making sure the client's running is the main issue, and once you do that, then everything syncs up fairly well, keeps track of that information, and passes it back and forth, so you're in good hands there. And then the other piece is the Power Pivot BI. You've probably heard a lot about Power Pivot in the past couple of years from Microsoft. There's been a big push to integrate business intelligence as it moves across all of the Microsoft products and platforms. SharePoint had brought in a number of BI integration pieces into SharePoint in the previous generations. Now, all that's kind of being integrated into one platform with Power Pivot. So note that is coming into play with the Enterprise Cal. So if you're on the lower tier that we talked about in licensing, you may not see that. But if you've got power users, or if you've got people that do a lot of slicing and dicing on a lot of data, or you've got people who actually maintain dashboards and do a lot of that work inside of SharePoint, they will get access to Power Pivot, which gives a lot of ability to go in and really provide reporting and provide interactive charting and all kinds of things that are very valuable. Again, we'll dive into that when the administrator and the usage pieces of it, but just know that you're getting kind of the top tier of the BI capabilities. The flip side of that, though, is that you're using a new capability. So if you've got dashboards or the rest of that information in SharePoint, say 2013, know that you're going to have to work on those to move those over into the new features, that this is a new platform for doing your business intelligence, for doing your dashboarding and all of your reporting inside of SharePoint. So know that as you're looking for doing the migration, this will be probably if you don't do this, then you're obviously okay and dive into the new features because it's going to be very valuable. But if you've got people who've done a lot of work on this, you're going to need to pay attention to what's happening here and really help them move forward.